Hey everyone, Noah Zerbe here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at the American political system. In this video, we're going to look at the philosophical and conceptual roots of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is a fascinating document. It's the world's oldest written constitution, first drafted in 1789 and in force ever since then. It's also one of the world's shortest constitutions, leaving considerable debate over its scope and meaning. It contains just 7 articles, which outline in a general fashion the broad structural contours of the federal government, including the structure and powers of the 3 branches of government, the relationship between the federal and state governments, and the process for ratifying and amending the Constitution. In addition, the Constitution contains 27 amendments which have expanded upon and clarified the Constitution over time. The Constitution builds on a number of broad principles and ideas, and in this video we're going to explore some of those in greater detail. The first of these is the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the people are the ultimate source of political power in a democratic government. In the context of the United States Constitution, popular sovereignty refers to the principle that the authority of government comes from the people themselves, who are the sole source of power in a democratic society. The concept of popular sovereignty is enshrined in the opening words of the Constitution's preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. This statement emphasizes that the Constitution was crafted and ratified by the people of the United States, acting as a collective and sovereign body. The notion of popular sovereignty is thus reflected throughout the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights to the provisions outlining the election of government officials. In addition to establishing that the people are the ultimate source of power, the concept of popular sovereignty also implies that government officials are accountable to the people who elected them. This accountability is reinforced by a system of checks and balances that divides power among the different branches of government and ensures that no single individual or group can dominate the political process. The Constitution is also rooted in the idea of limited government. This principle establishes the idea that the power of the government must be constrained and should be subject to certain checks and balances. It reflects the belief that government must be limited in its scope and authority in order to protect the liberty and rights of individuals. This is embodied most clearly in the idea of the separation of powers, with 3 distinct branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, each with its own specific responsibilities and limits on its authority. The division of power, along with the provisions that ensure each branch has the power to check the powers of the other branches, ensures that no single branch can become too powerful or dominate the others. The federal structure of the U.S. political system, which grants certain powers to the national government while reserving others to the states, is also a foundational principle of the U.S. Constitution. This division of power between the layers of government, that is, between the federal and state government, limits the scope of the federal government and ensures that the states have the ability to govern themselves and to enact policies that reflect the needs and values of their citizens. Additionally, the Bill of Rights, the first of 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, further limits the power of government by guaranteeing certain individual rights and protections such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press. These protections ensure that the government cannot infringe upon the basic rights and liberties of individuals. The idea of the rule of law, that all individuals, including those in government, are subject to the law and that no one is above the law, is another basic principle found in the U.S. Constitution. And finally, the idea of constitutionalism, or that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that all actions of the government must be consistent with its provisions and principles, is also a central tenet of the U.S. Constitution. We explore many of these concepts in greater detail in other videos, but collectively, these principles inform the basic ideas central to the Constitution. But where did all these ideas come from? There are several important sources. The first is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period of intellectual and cultural transformation in Europe that spanned from the late 17th century to the late 18th century. It was characterized by a focus on reason, empirical evidence, and individualism, and it challenged traditional authority and beliefs in fields such as politics, philosophy, science, and the arts. Enlightenment theorists like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Baron von Montesquieu, Voltaire, and particularly John Locke sought to apply reason and scientific methods to the study of society and human behavior, challenging the authority of traditional institutions such as the church and the monarchy. More specifically, John Locke's conception of natural rights, which asserts that individuals possess certain inalienable rights such as life, liberty, and property, was reflected in the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights, which guarantees the fundamental rights and protections for citizens. In the opening to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This sentiment is a direct reflection of John Locke's argument in his two treatises on government, when he writes, "A man, as has been proved, cannot subject himself to the arbitrary power of another, and having in the state of nature no arbitrary power over the life, liberty, or possession of another, but only so much as the law of nature gave him for the preservation of himself and the rest of mankind. This is all he doth, or can give up to the commonwealth, and by it to the legislative power, so that the legislative can have no more than this." Beyond the idea of natural or inalienable rights, John Locke's theory of the social contract was also adopted by the founders. Social contract theory posits that the government is formed by voluntary agreement between individuals to protect their natural rights. The Constitution establishes a framework for government that is based on the principle of the social contract, with a system of checks and balances, separation of powers, and individual rights that ensure the government is accountable to the people. Again, we can see an example of this in the Declaration of Independence. Continuing from our previous quotation, Jefferson writes, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem the most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is a clear extension of the idea of the social contract, that governments operate based on the consent of the people, and that when government fails to uphold its responsibility to protect life, liberty, and happiness of the people, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Finally, we can also see Locke's idea on limited government influencing the development of the U.S. Constitution. Locke believed that government should be limited in its power and authority in order to protect individual rights, which are operationalized in the U.S. Constitution through the separation of powers and the Bill of Rights, among others. Next, British political history also influences the U.S. Constitution. Most of the founders were British subjects, and they brought with them the historical development of rights and liberties in the British political system, most notably through the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was originally signed in 1215, essentially to resolve a dispute between King John of England and a group of rebelling lords. In the Magna Carta, King John agrees to certain rights for the nobility, articulating the principle that the king is subject to the rule of law, and that certain fundamental rights are granted. More specifically, the principle of the rule of law established under the Magna Carta is enshrined through the U.S. Constitution through provisions for due process, equal protection, and the separation of powers. Similarly, the idea of limited government embodied in the Magna Carta can also be found in the U.S. Constitution. The Magna Carta imposed certain limits on the power of the king, including requirements that the king obtain the consent of the lords before levying taxes or making decisions that affected the people. A similar principle of limited government is reflected in the U.S. Constitution's provisions for separation of powers, checks and balances, and the Bill of Rights. And finally, the Magna Carta also helped establish the idea of individual rights and protections. While the Magna Carta's provisions extended only to the nobility, it nevertheless granted certain rights, such as the right to a fair trial and the right to be free from arbitrary imprisonment. These rights and protections were later reflected in the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights. The early colonial history of the United States also played a role in the drafting of the Constitution. We can see this in several ways. First, the colonial charters and various state constitutions informed the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. Throughout the early settlement period, colonists developed their own charters and constitutions, such as the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which provided early models for American self-government. Second, the Revolutionary War experience influenced the text of the Constitution. The discourse around the Revolution was deeply rooted in ideas of individual liberty and the belief that the British government was tyrannical and had violated the natural rights of the colonists. Further, in the eyes of the founder, the war also reinforced the importance of limited government and the need to prevent a strong central government from violating the rights of the people and the states. These ideas were most strongly reflected in the Articles of Confederation. Adopted in 1777, the Articles were the first constitution of the United States. We examine the Articles of Confederation in more detail in another video, but for our purposes here, the text of the U.S. Constitution in many ways reflects the failures and shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation and an effort to rectify many of them. Finally, tribal governments also had an influence on the U.S. Constitution. Many of the founders had a deep familiarity with native nations. Benjamin Franklin, for example, had negotiated treaties with the Haudenosaunee, who were colonists called the Iroquois Confederation, and studied their system of governance. Similarly, John Adams encouraged other framers of the Constitution to study the governments of the ancient Germans and the modern Indians, emphasizing the latter's separation of powers among various branches of government, as well as the balance between individual independence and collective decisions on major questions through a national assembly. We can see these ideas operationalized most clearly in the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, also containing several elements that would be found in the U.S. Constitution, such as a bicameral legislature and a process for removing elected leaders from office, as well as the ideas found in various state constitutions like direct democracy, referenda, and recalls. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.